Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I returned to Whispering Trails after 20 years, I expected silence and memories. Instead, I found a forged signature, a stolen legacy, and an HOA president willing to commit fraud to claim my dead grandfather's land. They thought I'd walk away. They were dead wrong. I hadn't set foot in Whispering Trails for over 20 years, not since the summer I left for college with 2 suitcases and a chip on my shoulder big enough to knock out a bear. My grandfather, Frank Lawrence, stayed behind in that stubborn old cabin at the edge of town, a 6-acre patch of land with a hand-built hunting lodge, a cold mountain creek, and a pine forest so dense it swallowed sunlight by noon. He used to call it God's last favor to Colorado, and I believed him. Frank passed in March. Heart gave out while he was splitting logs. Knowing him, he probably swore at the tree before he fell. I inherited the property outright. No contest. The will was notarized, clear, and old-school legal. As Frank would say, the kind they can't poke holes in unless they got a goddamn chainsaw. I had the deed, the surveys, and the paperwork to prove it. 3 months later, I rolled back into Whispering Trails in a black pickup with Denver plates, a cooler full of beer, and zero patience for HOA politics. I wasn't here to renovate or flip it. Not yet anyway. I needed space. I needed silence. And more than anything, I needed to stand inside the last place that felt like it had meaning before I buried my own soul under a pile of tech startups and venture capital spreadsheets. The cabin hadn't changed. The porch still creaked like a cranky old man. The rusted weather vane still spun with a wobble. I stayed quiet the first 2 days, just chopping firewood, walking the property lines, and fixing up the shed roof before it collapsed under its own pessimism. The neighbors kept their distance. A few cautious waves, one guy on a mountain bike who slowed down, maybe wondering if I was a squatter or just another Californian who'd bought land sight unseen. I didn't care. The air smelled like wet soil and pine needles. That was enough. Then, on the 3rd morning, I found an envelope taped to the gate. No stamp, no return address, just a gold-embossed seal with 3 trees and the words Whispering Trails Community HOA. I opened it right there, leaning on the fence post, coffee in one hand, letter in the other. Dear occupant, it began, always a good sign. According to Section 34 of the Whispering Trails Development Plan, the property at address is deemed to be unclaimed community land under Conditional Legacy Clause B due to the failure of the last known occupant, Frank Lawrence, to officially opt in or opt out of HOA inclusion prior to death. Therefore, this land is now considered part of Whispering Trails Community Holdings and will be repurposed per the Veterans Memorial Initiative. Please vacate any personal effects or structures from the premises within 10 business days. Sincerely, Karen M. Flynn, President, Whispering Trails, HOA. I read it 3 times, then a 4th, just to make sure I wasn't still asleep and dreaming of Kafka after too much bourbon. My coffee went cold in my hand. 10 minutes later, I was behind the wheel, driving into town. The HOA office sat in a beige building next to a pet grooming salon called Posh, which seemed ironic given how dirty this move was. I walked in with the full binder. Deed, inheritance certificate, notarized will, survey maps. Everything Frank left me was in that folder, clean and above board. Inside the office, a woman sat behind the desk, mid-50s, blonde bob, expensive glasses that screamed, "I carry pepper spray," and a superiority complex. She didn't look up until I dropped the binder on the counter like a judge's gavel. "You're Karen Flynn?" I asked. She blinked once, slowly. Like I was a fly, she was deciding whether to swat or tolerate. "I am. Do you have an appointment?" "No. But you mailed me a piece of fiction that says you now own my grandfather's land. So, here I am bringing you the facts." I opened the binder, laid out the documents like cards in a poker hand. Deed, will, county tax assessments, topographical boundary maps. Karen glanced at them like they were expired coupons. "I'm sorry," she said flatly. "These aren't valid." I stared at her. "Come again." "They're not official under HOA standards. That property was included in the revised community plan, and since there was no formal opposition filed before Mr. Lawrence's passing, the parcel defaulted to community legacy status." I laughed. Not a polite laugh. the kind of laugh that gets you thrown out of fundraisers. Lady, this land was never part of your HOA. Frank Lawrence specifically refused to join it. He called it, and I quote, a bunch of lawn-obsessed fascists who think mailbox color is more important than liberty. Her jaw twitched. If you persist in occupying community property, I'll have to escalate this. Oh, please do, I said. Escalate your way through the state registry, the county land office, and the goddamn ghost of my grandfather. That's when she picked up the phone, pressed one button, spoke 3 words into the receiver. I need police. I stood there, stunned, as she looked at me like a criminal. Within 15 minutes, a deputy sheriff pulled into the lot. To his credit, he was calm, young, and clearly aware that this was HOA drama and not a hostage situation. I handed him the paperwork. He flipped through it, sighed, and asked if I could wait outside while they sorted things out. I waited. Eventually, the deputy came back out and returned my documents. This looks legit, he said. But they're going to contest it. I'd recommend getting a lawyer. Why? I asked. Because this woman, he said, nodding toward the building, has filed 3 similar complaints in the last year. 2 of them ended up in civil court. I looked back at the HOA office. Karen stood in the window, arms folded, mouth tight, like she'd just sucked on a lemon dipped in battery acid. I nodded. Then I guess it's war. The lawyer I hired came recommended by a friend who handled big energy contracts in Denver. His name was Ellis Tang. Late 30s, quiet as a monk, always looked like he was 3 chess moves ahead of you. I liked that. He didn't do small talk. He did documents. Within 48 hours of meeting, Ellis had already pulled every public record on Whispering Trails HOA, including the updated community development plan that Karen so proudly referenced when calling the cops on me. What we found made my jaw clench. Apparently, 2 years ago, the HOA filed an amendment with the County Planning Board proposing an expanded legacy perimeter for the purpose of preserving open space for future communal development. That's bureaucratic speak, for we're grabbing land that isn't ours and hoping nobody notices. Guess whose property line was suddenly redrawn to fit inside that magical perimeter? Ellis narrowed his eyes as he flipped through the scanned PDF of the plan. This is sloppy. Amateur even, but they submitted it, and no one opposed it at the time. Because no one told us, I said. Right, he replied, which means it technically got approved. I sat there, staring at the words Veterans Community Center Initiative, the supposed plan for my grandfather's land, as if reading them long enough would make them disappear. Below that, in small print, was a line that said grant funding anticipated via federal HUD and state rural revitalization program. They used Frank's death as a trigger, I muttered. They waited. Ellis nodded slowly. This wasn't spontaneous. It was prepared. The next 2 weeks were a bureaucratic nightmare dipped in acid. Ellis filed formal objections to the development plan, filed cease and desist letters, and contacted the county assessor's office to challenge the redrawn boundaries. But the wheels of local government moved like a constipated elephant, slow, painful, and completely indifferent to common sense. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. First came the notice tacked to the gate, community use area, subject to HOA regulation. The next day, I woke up to find 2 HOA board members, clipboards in hand, wandering around the edge of my property. I told them if they took one more step past the no trespassing sign, they'd be stepping into a lawsuit. They left, but that was just the start. That Friday, I received a certified letter from the County Department of Land Management. It said that due to pending title clarification, my parcel had been designated as provisionally administered land, which meant that Karen's grubby fingers were officially wrapped around the bureaucratic neck of my inheritance. Ellis's voice was tense on the phone. They're trying to create a paper trail that casts doubt on your ownership. It won't hold in court, but they're forcing us to play defense. I swore so loud the neighbor's dog stopped barking. Then came the real punch. Karen filed an actual lawsuit. Not against me personally, not yet, but a petition for custodianship over the property through a clause buried in HOA bylaws called community stewardship over neglected assets. According to their narrative, the property had been unoccupied for a statutory period of 6 months and therefore fell into a liminal zone of shared jurisdiction. Ellis sent me the document with the subject line, "You're going to love this." In her affidavit, Karen claimed that the property had no clear stewardship since the passing of Mr. Frank Lawrence, and had been maintained only minimally, suggesting intent to abandon. She included photographs of downed branches near the creek, a leaning fence post, and, I kid you not, my trash bins being out past the designated collection day. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sent Ellis every document I had, time-stamped utility bills, photos of me clearing brush, Amazon receipts for a new water pump, everything short of a selfie of me kissing the foundation. Ellis filed a counter-motion. But the damage was done. Karen had forced a procedural lock. The county issued a temporary management order in favor of the HOA, pending judicial review, which meant I couldn't make structural changes to the property without HOA approval. I couldn't even repaint the cabin without filing a formal request to the same group of suburban warlords trying to steal it. They sent an email the next day, reminding me that earth tone paint colors are preferred under Article 17 of Community Guidelines. I replied with a picture of my middle finger holding a brush dipped in black. By the end of the month, Karen had applied for a development grant from the State Rural Revitalization Fund. She wanted to repurpose the land for a veterans wellness park and reflection center, using my grandfather's status as a Korean War veteran as the justification. The audacity made my skin crawl. She weaponized Frank's memory like a PR tool, and worst of all, it was working. A local news blog published a soft piece about the HOA's commitment to honoring legacy land. There was a photo of Karen holding a folded American flag she claimed was recovered from the property. That flag was mine. Frank's. It had been in the attic since the funeral. I was done playing defense. I always knew money could move mountains. I just never expected to find one built on my own name. It started with a throwaway comment Ellis made during a strategy call, late one night after he'd spent 8 hours combing through county budget records and HOA financials. You know, he said, sipping what had to be his 5th cup of coffee, "It's weird. The HOA's legal fund tripled its reserves 2 years ago, right around the time they expanded their development plan. The timeline is suspicious." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. "Where'd the money come from?" Ellis shrugged. "It's routed through a nonprofit, Whispering Trails Development Initiative. Big donors. Mostly anonymized." The name tickled something in my memory. I opened the old email archives tied to my investment firm, a cluttered mess of pitch decks, reports, and board memos. After about an hour of searching, there it was. WTDI, Opportunity Fund Class C, one of my trust's minor holdings, a feel-good fund, rural revitalization, community wellness, total tax write-off. My CFO probably greenlit it without a second thought. I clicked deeper. Investor Kane E. Lawrence. Primary. Contributed $1.6 million via Den Venture Capital Partners Trust, D. My stomach dropped. I wasn't just some guy they were trying to screw over. I was paying for the pleasure. I called Ellis. "Jesus Christ," he muttered after I explained it. "You're not just funding the HOA's operations. You might be paying for Karen's lawyers." That was the moment something in me snapped. Within 48 hours, my financial manager had drafted the necessary pullback orders. The trust froze all ongoing disbursements to WTDI, citing material conflict of interest and misuse of charter intent. I ordered a forensic review of all grant allocations issued over the last 3 years. Then I made it public. I sent a letter that notarized, sharp, and designed to bleed to the HOA board, the Development Fund's board of directors, the local media, and the Colorado Attorney General's office. Effective immediately, all funding previously granted to Whispering Trails Development Initiative through the Den Venture Capital Partners Trust is suspended pending investigation of fiduciary misconduct, unauthorized use of grant money, and potential fraudulent land acquisition under false pretenses. I ended it with one line in bold. I refuse to bankroll corruption designed to steal my grandfather's home. The fallout was instant. Karen called a special emergency board meeting. Locked doors, no press. But it was too late. Reporters were already knocking. The story broke that afternoon. Investor freezes HOA funding amidst land theft scandal. My name was front and center. I didn't mind. Let them see it. Within a day, the fund's account was under audit by both state and federal regulators. The state attorney general's office issued a statement. "We take allegations of fraudulent land acquisition and improper grant usage seriously. A preliminary inquiry has been initiated." Karen tried to spin it, released a tone-deaf statement about commitment to community integrity and temporary funding interruptions. But her voice trembled at the press conference, and for the first time, the tight veneer of control cracked. That weekend, I got an anonymous email. No name, no signature, just scanned PDFs. Internal emails between Karen and the fund's now silent executive director. One line jumped out. If he ever figures out the WTDI link, kill the Veteran Center narrative immediately. She knew. She knew exactly who I was, where the money came from, and how fragile her little empire was. She didn't care. She planned to milk the fund until the property was flipped, sold to some civic redevelopment shell, and her hands washed clean. Too bad for her, I wasn't in the mood to stay clean. I filed 2 new actions, one federal complaint with HUD's Office of Inspector General and another with the Colorado State Auditor. Ellis called in favors. We got a meeting with a regional HUD investigator who didn't like fraud, especially when it involved abusing veteran programs. By the end of the meeting, he'd asked for everything: grant files, emails, HOA, meeting minutes, property assessments, even photographs of the land. That was the moment we turned from defendants into aggressors. Karen must have felt it. The next day, someone in a gray Lexus tried to accidentally clip the back end of my truck in the grocery store parking lot. It didn't work, but the message was clear. So I left my cabin lights on that night, but sat in the dark with a loaded shotgun across my lap, just in case. Frank wouldn't have blinked. Neither did I. Then came the real twist. Ellis called, his voice tight. "You're going to want to sit down." I was already sitting. One of the documents in the HOA's legal submission, the one they claimed your grandfather signed, the affidavit declining HOA opt-out back in the 80s. Yeah, it's fake. The notary listed on it, disbarred 5 years ago, convicted of forgery. We have a certified expert review confirming the signature is fabricated. For a long second, I didn't speak. Then I started laughing. Loud, deep, bitter laughter that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. They'd forged a dead man's signature to steal his land, and they did it using a known criminal. I leaned back, stared up at the wooden beams of Frank's old ceiling, and said out loud, "You picked the wrong goddamn grandson." The day the auditors arrived at the Whispering Trails HOA office, I drove into town just to watch. 2 black Suburbans parked outside the beige stucco building like harbingers of administrative death. 3 agents stepped out, 1 from the Colorado State Auditor's Office, 2 from HUD's Regional Enforcement Unit. Suits, badges, briefcases. The kind of people who don't knock. They inform. Karen stood at the door when they entered. I could see her through the glass. For a woman who loved control, she looked like someone whose teeth were about to fall out mid-smile. The moment her eyes met mine across the parking lot, I gave her the same wave she once gave me when I brought in Frank's deed. Open palm, no warmth. Ellis called me an hour later, voice practically buzzing. They pulled everything. Hard drives, physical files, financials, even the minutes from board meetings. This is not a courtesy audit. This is a forensic hit. By the end of the day, Karen's email access was suspended. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen pending inquiry, and 2 board members resigned, one citing medical burnout, the other fleeing to Arizona with his RV, and 2 chihuahuas. The whispers started before sunset. The local HOA Facebook group, previously dominated by garden club updates and passive-aggressive posts about trash bins, exploded with speculation. Someone uploaded a spreadsheet showing unexplained withdrawals from the HOA Improvement Fund totaling over $300,000 across 4 years. A different user posted a photo of Karen's remodeled kitchen, conveniently finished the same month the HOA paid for a community culinary wellness space feasibility study. The grift wasn't clever, it was comfortable. Like she'd gotten away with it so long, she stopped bothering to cover the tracks. The next morning, a reporter from the Chaffee County Ledger called me for a statement. I gave them a short quote. They didn't just try to steal my land. They tried to rewrite reality on the county's dime. 2 days later, the dam broke. The Denver Sentinel ran a headline that stretched across the top of the paper in bold red letters. Veterans' legacy used in HOA land fraud scheme. Millions in grants under review. The story included internal HOA memos, copies of grant applications, bearing falsified community support letters, and an interview with a former Whispering Trails treasurer, a frail, terrified man named Richard Hines, who hadn't spoken publicly in over a year. He told the reporter he'd been pressured into signing blank checks, and when he asked too many questions about the Veteran Reflection Center, Karen threatened to accuse him of embezzlement. He showed up at my cabin 2 days later, hat in hand, shaking like a kicked dog. I didn't know what she was doing at first, he told me, voice hoarse. Then I saw the checks going to her daughter's college fund. And the landscaping company, they never showed up. She told me to shut up and sign. I brought him inside, made coffee, and took his sworn statement. Ellis filed it with the court before the sun went down. More came forward after that. A woman in her 60s who'd been evicted from her home 3 years prior after her husband died, her name scrubbed from the deed after the HOA claimed delinquent fees she never owed. A young couple whose backlot mysteriously became public green space overnight. A man who lost a shed and workshop when Karen claimed it violated architectural congruency and called in county code enforcement. Each story echoed the same pattern: isolation, legal overwhelm, and compliance under pressure. I began to feel it like a bruise beneath the skin. This wasn't just about me or Frank. This was systemic. Karen had created a structure that fed on confusion and fear, and people, real people, had lost homes because of it. Hood's investigative team made it official. A public memorandum cited probable cause for criminal misconduct, including misappropriation of federal grant funds, fraudulent land acquisitions, and falsification of administrative documents. The Office of the Inspector General opened a parallel inquiry. The HOA, in a desperate PR move, tried to distance itself from Karen, issuing a statement that said, "Individual actions do not reflect community values." But it was too late. At the next community meeting, hastily relocated to a school gymnasium because the HOA office was now sealed, Karen walked into silence. No applause, no nods. Just 50-plus homeowners staring at her like she was something they found under a rock. She still tried, claimed the accusations were exaggerated, the audits were political, the documents misunderstood. Then Richard Hines stood up. "She stole everything," he said, voice stronger this time, "and you let her." Karen froze, just for a second, then turned and left. She didn't show her face for another week. Ellis and I filed a civil claim for restitution totaling over $600,000, representing both property damages and punitive damages. We attached it to a class action suit co-signed by 4 other residents. That was the first time I saw Ellis actually smile. "Now," he said, "we don't just take her down. We burn the fucking house she built." Court smells like dust, old coffee, and quiet judgment. I sat there in a press suit that didn't quite fit right, watching Karen Flynn walk into the courtroom like it was a beauty pageant and she'd already been crowned. Her lawyer, some sharp-jawed, smug type in a pinstripe suit, looked equally confident, flashing a rehearsed smile at the press. She didn't look scared. She looked offended. The trial was fast-tracked. Between HUD's formal referral, the Colorado State Auditor's findings, and the civil class action my lawyer had filed, the court had more than enough incentive to prioritize the case. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, neighbors, former HOA members, even a few people who had quietly suffered in silence until now. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was about power. The kind of power that thrives in cul-de-sacs, hidden behind bylaws and garden regulations. Ellis, cool as always, laid out our case in opening arguments. "This is not a dispute over grass height or mailbox paint," he told the jury. "This is organized fraud, the deliberate misuse of federal funds, the falsification of public documents, and the systemic abuse of homeowners who trusted a community organization, only to be exploited by it." Karen's team tried to paint her as a passionate community leader who had been misled by incompetent board members and overwhelmed by the scope of her responsibilities. They leaned hard on the idea that she was merely executing decisions made by others. She never signed checks, they said. She only followed board votes. She didn't personally benefit. That's when Ellis dropped the receipts. Bank transfers to her personal account, labeled board stipend reimbursement. HOA checks used for community event decor that matched invoices from a Vermont hotel, a wire to a private college under the name of her daughter. The jury stared in silence as each one flashed on the overhead monitor. Then came the bombshell, the affidavit Karen submitted months ago, claiming my grandfather had tacitly consented to HOA jurisdiction. Ellis passed it to the court clerk. It was our turn to weaponize the forgery. Ellis called a forensic document analyst to the stand. Calm, gray-haired, steady hands. He testified that the notary listed on the affidavit, a Clifford R. Mendez, had been stripped of his license 5 years ago for document fraud. The signature didn't match any verified samples. The stamp was a fake, purchased from an online vendor who coincidentally had records of shipment to Karen's P.O. box. Karen's lawyer objected, of course, claimed the document had been provided by a third party and that Karen had no knowledge of its authenticity. But the damage was done. The judge asked Karen directly if she'd reviewed the document before submitting it to the county as evidence. She said yes. The courtroom was dead silent. That's when things got dicey. During cross-examination, Karen's lawyer pulled out one of our own exhibits, my grandfather's notarized will, and claimed that document had inconsistencies in the notary seal. Ellis stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. Objection. The judge allowed it, with hesitation. I sat frozen as the court brought in a different handwriting analyst, a court-appointed one. She reviewed the document, tilted her head, squinted. "I see a mismatch on the seal pressure," she said carefully. "The signature looks legitimate, but I cannot confirm with full certainty that the seal is original." The oxygen left my lungs. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. For a few terrifying minutes, everything we'd built, every affidavit, every filing, every headline, felt like it might unravel under one grainy stamp and a broken notary seal. The judge called a recess. I stepped outside, pacing the marble floor of the courthouse like a man waiting for the executioner to tap him on the shoulder. Ellis was already on his phone. He didn't say a word, just listened, then hung up. He turned to me. "We got him." "Who?" "The original notary, the real one. He moved to Arizona, retired." "But we found him." 2 hours later, an old man named Gregory Stone, sunburned, ponytailed, and proudly wearing a T-shirt that said, "Notary publics do it by the book," walked into the courtroom and confirmed under oath that he had notarized Frank's will. He even had his original notary log with Frank's signature, thumbprint, and a photo from that day. I nearly collapsed. Karen, on the other hand, looked like someone had just flipped her soul inside out. The trial resumed. The court reinstated the will. Ellis gave the closing argument like he'd been waiting his whole life for it. This woman tried to erase a man's legacy to build a monument to her own ego. She didn't just break the law, she broke the public trust. The jury didn't take long. They found Karen Flynn guilty on all counts: fraudulent use of federal funds, forgery of legal documents, unlawful seizure of private property, abuse of fiduciary duty as president of a nonprofit, obstruction of justice. The judge ordered her immediate remand to custody pending final sentencing. She stood, trembling, lips tight, as the bailiff took her by the elbow. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched the door close behind her and thought, that sound? That's justice locking itself in for the night. Sentencing was scheduled 3 weeks after the verdict. The courtroom was quieter this time. Fewer reporters, no cameras, no murmuring HOA loyalists. Just a few residents in the pews, some with arms crossed, others holding folders of their own evidence, as if still afraid it might all slip away. Karen entered in a beige jail-issued pantsuit, hands cuffed at the front. The dye in her hair had started to fade, revealing gray at the roots. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but in presence. Like someone who had once stood on a self-built pedestal and now realized the whole damn thing was made of cardboard and lies. The judge was firm, calm, and visibly exhausted from the circus she'd presided over. Before the sentence was delivered, victims were allowed to speak. First was Richard Hines, the former treasurer. His voice cracked halfway through, but he kept going. "She made me complicit. I lost my reputation, my friends. People thought I was stealing. I didn't know how to fight back." Then came Mrs. Delaney, the widow who'd been forced out of her home after her husband died. She held up the notice the HOA had nailed to her door. Her hands shook. "I still have nightmares," she said. "They told me if I didn't leave, I'd be fined $500 a day. I couldn't afford to stay. I left behind 40 years of life. I was the last." I walked to the podium, looked at Karen, and then turned to the judge. "My grandfather wasn't a rich man," I said, "but he had something worth more than money: his land, his principles, his refusal to be bullied. He spent decades keeping this community safe and quiet and sane, and this woman tried to steal his legacy for a grant application. She turned patriotism into PR. She made a business out of fraud and abuse. I don't want vengeance. I want assurance that people like her never do this to anyone else again." The judge nodded once and opened the folder in front of her. "Karen Elizabeth Flynn," she began, "you were entrusted with power by your community. You used that power to enrich yourself, to deceive government agencies, and to forcibly remove citizens from their homes. Your actions were not negligent. They were calculated, sustained, and self-serving. Then came the numbers. 12 years of federal imprisonment, no parole before year 7. Restitution of $1.2 million in fraudulently obtained grant funds. Additional fines totaling $400,000 for civil damages. Personal liability for punitive damages in the civil suit, an additional $600,000 split among 5 named plaintiffs. Ban from serving in any fiduciary, nonprofit, or HOA-related role for life. The courtroom didn't cheer. This wasn't a movie, but I swear I heard someone quietly whisper, "Finally." Karen didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just stared ahead, stone-faced, as the bailiff took her by the arm and led her out the back. But the hammer hadn't fallen alone. 2 HOA board members were indicted on misdemeanor charges for negligent misappropriation of funds and received suspended sentences, along with community service and full removal from office. The HOA as a legal entity was dissolved by court order. Its assets, including 2 checking accounts, a building lease, and a fleet of rented maintenance equipment, were liquidated and distributed toward restitution. Then came the final ruling on my land. The court declared the 6-acre property and all structures upon it exempt from any past, present, or future jurisdiction of any HOA, citing both the original deed and the fraudulent schemes attempted against it. A new entry was placed in the county registry. Private estate, protected title class, no administrative liens permitted. It felt like winning back more than property. It felt like restoring something that was stolen long before Karen ever saw a dollar. Ellis met me outside the courthouse, smiling the way a man does after surviving a war he didn't want to fight. "Congratulations," he said, handing me the final docket. I looked at the paper, my name, my grandfather's land, one clean line that said ownership verified, title clear. We shook hands. The kind of handshake you only do when it cost both of you too much to get here. For the first time in months, the land was quiet again. Not the silence of threat, not that brittle tension I'd grown used to, like waiting for a phone to ring with bad news, but the honest quiet of nature, trees breathing, creek running, wind pushing through pine needles like fingers over strings. I stood on the back porch of the cabin, coffee in hand, and listened to it like I was learning a language all over again. The court had cleared the property. My name was on every line that mattered, the deed, the title, the protected status. I could have walked away, sold it, flipped it, made a tidy profit, gone back to my condo in Denver and let this entire saga become a dinner party anecdote. But I didn't. Because no matter how much money I'd made in the last decade, no asset in my portfolio ever felt as earned as these 6 acres of raw, stubborn land. So I stayed. At first, it was just cleanup. Tearing down the fence posts Karen's goons had installed, repainting the cabin, replacing a broken pane in the loft window where a branch had punched through last winter. The place needed work, but it responded to care the way old things do. Slowly, with patience, as if testing whether I meant it. The mailbox still had Frank's name on it. I left it that way. The neighbors started coming back around. At first, cautiously, a wave here, a nod there, then longer conversations. Some offered help, others just wanted to apologize. Apparently, Karen's grip had been tighter than anyone realized. She ruled not with law, but with implied consequence. Fines that never got documented, violations that weren't real, and gossip weaponized with surgical precision. They were ashamed. I didn't blame them. It's easy to doubt yourself when someone speaks with confidence and holds a clipboard. One afternoon, a teenage girl, maybe 16, knocked on the cabin door. She said her grandmother had lived in Whispering Trails before being coerced into selling her house at a discount after missing a few HOA payments. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but her eyes were steel. "She cried when she saw what you did," the girl said. "She said you made it okay to be mad. That hit harder than any verdict, so I made a decision." I contacted a few people I knew, not venture capitalists or real estate sharks, but folks who cared about legacy, community, and impact. Together, we formed a private foundation. No HOA, no board of Karens, just a simple, unincorporated trust with one mission: protect the land and honor its stories. We called it the Whispering Trails Veterans Heritage Center. Not a park, not a museum, a living space where veterans and their families could come for weekend retreats, storytelling workshops, and memorial hikes. Not a government program, not a campaign for votes. Just a piece of soil that would never again be stolen, distorted, or leased to the highest bidder. Ellis helped structure the legal entity. I filed the paperwork myself. We held the first event in late September, a small gathering, just 15 people. Campfire, coffee, one guitar, and an old black and white photo of Frank sitting on the porch with his hunting rifle across his lap and a smile that said, "Come take it." I kept the crowd small on purpose. Bigger would come later. I even invited the new interim mayor, a younger guy, skeptical of HOA overreach, who'd quietly started drafting new policies on nonprofit accountability in unincorporated communities. He stood beside me during the opening remarks, looked out at the forest, and said, "You know, this place feels real." "It is," I said, "because it never sold out." That night, I stood at the edge of the creek and looked up at the stars. For the first time since Frank passed, I felt like I wasn't just surviving his absence. I was living in the echo of his defiance. This land had teeth. And finally, so did I. Winter came early that year. By mid-October, the first snow dusted the trees like powdered sugar. The creek slowed under a skin of ice. Deer left tracks across the driveway. I installed a new wood stove inside the cabin. The old one had too many rusted seams, and for the first time since this all began, I slept a full night without waking at the sound of tires crunching gravel. The last of the lawsuits closed in November. Karen Flynn was transferred to a federal facility in Kansas, where she would serve 12 years without parole. The HOA board, stripped of all assets, no longer legally existed. The county clerk's office updated property records to mark Whispering Trails HOA as dissolved by court order. Their website vanished, their hotline disconnected. Whispering Trails didn't fall apart. It woke up. By Christmas, the neighborhood looked different, warmer. Lawn signs for community listening sessions popped up. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years were standing on porches, sharing coffee. Someone started a newsletter, just printed pages stapled to mailboxes with duct tape, called No More Karens. It was half jokes, half neighborhood watch updates, and everyone read it. I still kept my distance. Not out of resentment, just preservation. I'd fought my war. Now the town had to figure out who it wanted to be without tyrants in polo shirts telling them what shade of beige their house could be. Ellis called in early December to say the last payment had cleared. Restitution from Karen's liquidated assets. My portion, $250,000. I used most of it to build an extension on the cabin, a workshop and meeting room with wide cedar beams and a flagstone floor. Above the door, I hung a sign hand-carved from one of Frank's fallen trees. "This land is free. We don't do Karens here." The dedication ceremony was quiet. Just me, a few vets, and Richard Hines, the ex-treasurer, now volunteering at the Heritage Center. We burned the last copy of the HOA bylaws in the campfire. Watched the paper curl and blacken. I said a few words. Nothing fancy, just what Frank would have said. They can take the money, they can take the job titles, but they don't get the soul. After that, I walked down to the old creek, where the water barely moved under the frost, a place where my grandfather once fished with me, where we buried a dog named Rusty, where I first learned what it meant to stand your ground. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small wooden box that held Frank's medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, a patch from his old infantry division. I set them gently on a rock by the water, not to leave them, just to remember. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about courtrooms or signatures or headlines. It was about drawing a line no one else would dare cross again, not with fake authority, not with forged paperwork, not with a smile that says, "I know better," when they don't. That night, I poured a glass of bourbon, stepped out onto the porch, and looked at the land that almost wasn't mine. It was quiet, but not empty. And when a journalist called from a streaming service 2 weeks later, said they wanted to make a docudrama about the HOA scandal, asked if I'd sell the rights, I just laughed and told him, "Only if you make me look hotter than I am."